Well, good morning, John. We're recording this on Thursday morning, and a lot's happened since you left for your well-deserved break in Thailand and Vietnam. We've had the 12-day war. We've had the NATO conference. We've had inflation numbers coming out of the central banks and statements from the governor and the RBA. A lot to talk about. John, let's start off with the 12-day war and the decline in the oil price. What are your observations?
Well, the 12-day war, Paul. I mean, I left before the 12-day war started, and I'm back after it finished. So that's what happens when you take 2 weeks off. You can miss a lot. But I think it's interesting from the aspect that it was all over in 12 days. We obviously observed that America came in and did what they had to do after Israel opened up the opportunity. I think it's important to understand that the biggest supporter of Iran is Russia, and the defence systems of Iran were fairly hopeless in terms of the bombardments and the targeted attacks. It says a lot about the support of Russia and what the outlook is for their war in Ukraine. There's no doubt that apart from nuclear weapons, they're at a serious disadvantage in taking on the West led by America. So I think that's the big thing to come out of it. I think that was followed up in NATO, Paul. I think the support by NATO countries for America and therefore for what America did in Iran to stymie that development of nuclear warheads is significant. And the agreement which has been reached for a commitment towards 5% over 10 years of GDP investment is a very strong warning sign to Russia that the defence mechanism of Europe against them is going to be fortified, and America is going to stay in that alliance. America's ingenuity, its ability to develop weapons is undeniable, and they're at the forefront. And I think we're heading towards some settlement in Ukraine, Russia, sooner rather than later, given what we've seen in Iran.
Yes, one of the most important economic and financial consequences has been the fall in the oil price. So when Iran was threatening to perhaps block the Strait of Hormuz, we shouldn't forget that 90% of Iran's oil exports go to China. Obviously, China was not keen on them stopping their oil exports and might have exerted pressure. The Iranians ultimately did not attack the oil assets of either their neighbors or mine the Strait of Hormuz. That's a great, so we've now seen the war premium in the oil price reduce, which basically reduces inflationary pressure and potentially allows central banks to start cutting interest rates. Surely that's good for share markets all over the world.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there. As you said, the oil price spiked and then has fallen back rapidly. It appeared to me that the controlling entities of OPEC, and let's be clear, that's Saudi Arabia, in effect, as a major producer, and its neighbours, Qatar and United Arab Emirates. I mean, they were not keen on a disruption in the Middle East. They're not supporters of Iran. I think we have to remember, as I said this recently, the first overseas trip by Trump was to the Middle East and seeing these countries. Whether he tipped them off, I don't know, but he certainly got their support economically for what the American economy. We've seen that with some trade deals and some giveaways. But I think there's also been some covert agreements to support the American bond market and the American economy and to continue two-way trade. So, they were passively watching what was going on in the Iran conflict. They didn't get involved. Their protests were fairly muted. And the result is we've seen the oil price come back to virtually where it was pre this kerfuffle. And America's going to go on its merry way and start, producing oil. Now, as you and I have discussed, the $60 price for a barrel is quite crucial, because below that, American production becomes, in many respects, uneconomical. I'm sure the OPEC is happy at $60 because they make a lot of money. They just won't be selling it to America at that price. They'll be selling it to everywhere else. And as you say, I think the war can work away at $60, and not stir up inflation.
And the Europeans at the NATO conference agreeing to 5% of GDP to be spent on defence over the next 10 years. That's 3.5% dedicated to soldiers and equipment, but 1.5% on top of that dedicated to security matters. That's a huge stimulation to European investment, to industrialization, to manufacturing, and particularly, I think, to American armament sales.
Absolutely. Look, it's a terrible way to talk about economic growth. It is a real issue for human society. That's the way we grow. But putting that aside, this is stimulation that the European economy needed. It's been in some sort of coma since the GFC, and not helped by COVID. Very low growth, aging population, youth unemployment. This gives some backbone to those economies. And the only outlier I could see, I think Trump noted this, was Spain, who thinks that they don't need to be part of the 5% deal. Maybe they think they're too far away from Russia to worry about, but we'll see how that plays out. But it was interesting when Trump talked about Spain to a question. He said if Spain doesn't come in, he'll hit them with tariffs. So he's using tariffs as a barter to get agreement by NATO countries to increase their defence expenditure. And as you say, Paul, there will be a benefit to the American manufacturing sector in supplying arms and intellectual know-how. And we've just seen the intellectual know-how on display in Iran. It's pretty bloody good.
Yeah.
And it's way ahead of the rest of the world and way ahead of Russia. And I go back to that point, Russia has got a warning. I know America and Russia doesn't want to meet in a battlefield, but Russia must be seeing that if America supports NATO with its intellectual property and defence, then Russia is at a serious disadvantage.
Yeah. In the last couple of days, the governor of the Federal Reserve, Jay Powell, has given testimony to Congress. It's basically indicated that although there are some signs of weakness, he doesn't feel that the American economy is such that he has to rush into interest rate cuts, indicating that he wants to wait and see the inflationary effects of tariffs before he does anything. Australia seems to be in a slightly different place as far as the CPI reads from Tuesday are concerned. Would you care to illuminate those points?
Look, there's a lot to unpack. I mean, I'm sort of looking at the US Congress testimony and the Q&A. The big thing that came out of that was prior to the Q&A, Powell got another broadside from Trump, which to me, and I've been saying this, that Powell's days are becoming numbered in terms of his leadership of the Federal Reserve. Now, how that plays out, time will tell. Trump is adamant interest rates have to come down. Trump's a little bit delusional. He's putting too much emphasis on cash rates and not enough on bond rates, but I'll get back to that. In terms of testimony, just make this point that Powell was very reticent to talk about the fiscal policy situation, which I found quite amazing. He was tempted by Democrat questions about the big budget, the big, beautiful budget. He didn't want to go there because it's not beautiful in terms of the outlook for American debt. So there's pressure coming there from the American administration. Come back to Australia. As you said, inflation numbers quite good, but they were rolling off 12 months ago, very bad numbers. If you want to care to look at May, June, July last year, very high inflation numbers. So we're coming down rapidly off those. The benefit more recently has been the kick in the Australian dollar. But it's only 65 cents, so let's not get too excited. But there's a reason why, having gone overseas, and we'll talk about it shortly, why the Australian dollar needs to be weak in terms of tourism. But that revaluation from 58 helped inflation, and the oil price Petrol price came down in April. We've got to remember that Trump drove the price of oil down to $60 before the kick up in June with the Iran war. They're coming through, and in terms of also the support from government, the cost of living support for energy bills. We had all these ratbag economists a year ago telling us that budget deficits would cause inflation. Well, where are they today? They're all now crying about an interest rate cut because inflation's coming down. How soon they forget the absurdity of some of their statements a year ago, some of these economists.
So with the CPI number coming out on last Tuesday, it looks like an interest rate cut from our 3.8% official cash rate is due for a 25 basis point cut on the 8th of July. That'll be good for the Australian economy. And in the meantime, overnight, I think NASDAQ hit a new all-time high. We're within 1% of our all-time high. It's all looking pretty good.
Well, there's more interesting news to come. And I take your point. I think we are in a cut interest rate cycle. In Australia, we've been forecasting 3% by Christmas. I think that's still in train. We've been advising our clients and listeners that they've got to start thinking about their fixed income book, that there'll be a mad scramble for income. Clients obviously got some products being developed and on offer, and I just look at our client capital share issue. The dividend is ridiculously high. I think there'll be a scramble for a whole lot of high-yielding LICs in the next 6 months, so that's just one interesting aspect of the market. So scramble coming down, then there'll be another scramble, Paul. As I said earlier, there's going to be a move on the Federal Reserve by the Trump administration. There's no doubt that America's entering a QE program once Trump's removed the head of the Treasury, the head of the Federal Reserve. He's talking about 2 and 3% cut in interest rates, the cost of debt to the American government. That can only come through the bond market. That can only come through a QE policy. I'm adamant that when he went to the Middle East, he was getting some capital support for the American bond market. He needs to replace China and probably Japan and UK as bond owners of the American bond market. He needs to find new international bond buyers. It's probably the Middle East. He's probably told them that, look, get set now because I'm going to push the price down. I think it was interesting last week, while I think of it, Paul, I'm sitting there watching CNN, which Trump hates, and I must admit I sort of agree with him. It's a pretty appalling news service internationally, but it's quite clear. I heard Trump say that get the oil price down in the middle of the and guess what? The oil price, he has this tremendous power through signaling to the market to get the result he wants, and it's almost like he's telling people or telling the market, this is the price I want, get it there. Yeah. And it was quite amazing how it happened. The oil price. I think he's going to do the same in interest rates. The bond vigilantes will not be able to take on a Federal Reserve driven by a Trump nominee printing money. Yeah. So we're going to enter quite a wild period. One thing you can say, Paul, is interest rates are coming down. The question is whether they come down to inflation or they go below inflation, like the previous QE policies we saw pre-COVID. We'll be updating weekly on this matter I can see for the foreseeable future, Paul. This will be a constant topic of conversation. John,
we've got 2 or 3 minutes left. You've spent a fortnight in Thailand and Vietnam. How does Australia look from afar?
Look, the comment I would make is, they're happy economies. They're bustling and, they're big, a lot of people, low pay, obviously, but very high service levels. Remarkably cheap places to visit, compared to Australia. And it makes you reflect when you look back why the Australian dollar is 65 cents. Now, I've been saying it's undervalued and it probably is going to revalue as the American dollar comes back under a QE policy. But we've got to be conscious of the fact that Australia is a very expensive place to live. And a cheap Australian dollar is one of the offsets for foreigners to come here and visit, Without that, it is an expensive place to visit. So we've got to be very careful about that aspect of it. And as I said earlier in an answer to a question about the dynamic growth coming out of the Middle East and its relationship with America, but there's no doubt when you travel through Asia and you talk to other tourists, there's a lot of Middle Eastern tourists there, and you talk about their economy, and that their real focus is on tourism, growing their economies by encouraging people. And you think about the Middle East, it hasn't been the great tourist destination of the past. So they are really focused on getting the Western tourists to visit there. And they're spending fortunes on developing infrastructure and making it easy for people to get there. That's one of the reasons why the Iranian war was always going to end quickly, because it's not in the interest of the Middle East to upset the tourism trade developing in those major cities in the Middle East. Going back to Asia, you know, you're struck by the quality of their internet. It's amazing how people can get around. You know, you go to like Hanoi, 10 million people. You sit back and think about Australia's energy and our internet, and you think, what is going on in this country? Our internet's poor compared to international. Never had any trouble with internet at all over there. As I said earlier, the cost of living was good, and energy didn't seem to be a big issue over there in terms of the cost of energy. Just talking to people, you know, and they use a lot of it, as you can imagine. And they're, you know, I think Australia again has got to be careful. And I'd like to see a lot more Australian investment in these emerging economies. You know, if we don't invest in places like Vietnam and Thailand and Cambodia, China will, and even Russia will, to get, you know, positioned in those economies. That's not in our interest. So, you know, we need to build up that trade, and we're throwing so much capital at America for our. We need to focus our capital more on great trade opportunities in these regions with big populations.
John, we'll have to leave it there. A lot to digest, lots of interesting insights. Thank you so much, and we will see you next week.
We will.